My name is Isabel Hughes. I'm Associate Director here at the Museum of English Rural Life and Vice President of AIMA. I should also like to extend a warm welcome to you all. We're looking forward to an exciting few days. Over the last year or so, we have all had to become more familiar with meeting, studying, and socialising online. We are all still learning about the potential of the digital and hope that you enjoy the next few days, even though you won't actually be in Reading. Since our last Congress in Tartu, Estonia in 2017, our executive committee has been busy. Prior to the pandemic, we were able to attend 2 inspiring executive committee meetings in Delhi, India, hosted by Surajit Sarkar in 2018, and in Ljubljana in Slovenia, hosted by Barbara Sozik in 2019. Each was memorable, and full reports can be found on the AIMA website. We were, of course, unable to meet face-to-face for the Congress last year, but our committee has continued to work together to take AIMA forward. The Executive Committee has met regularly through Zoom, and in November planned and delivered a successful online symposium, Coping with Crisis in Agricultural Museums, which was put together and hosted by Klaus Kropp. We see this method of communicating and sharing learning as a positive way forward for AIMA and would welcome your views. The symposium presentations can be viewed on our YouTube channel. We have also put an emphasis on providing more regular and accessible content on our website, as well as providing regular and comprehensive newsletters, ably prepared by Cosette Griffin-Kramer. Also in the last year, we learnt of the deaths of 2 active and highly influential AIMA members. First, Professor Hisashi Horio, who studied at Kyoto University and was a long-standing and active committee member. He came to our last meeting in Ljubljana in the summer of 2018, as well as the author of a key work on Japanese agricultural tools published in 1976. We also lost Moet Barbov, a regular contributor to our meetings and the Congress, who wrote prolifically on bread making, from cultivation to confection and consumption. First in relation to the Alentejo region of Portugal, where women traditionally kneaded the bread, with her publication Bread in Portugal, 2008, followed by The Tradition of Bread in Portugal in 2011, and most recently, French Regional Breads, published in 2018. Reading University and the Museum of English Rural Life has participated in the work of AIMA from the beginning. Our past director, Professor Ted Collins, was an early supporter of AIMA, and it was almost exactly 45 years ago that the MERL at Reading hosted the Congress. Today, we are delighted to hand over to our current director, Kate Arnold-Forster, who will introduce our museum.
Hello and welcome once again. I also wanted to add how absolutely delighted I am that despite a very challenging time over the last year and a half, we are finally meeting together for this Congress, very aptly titled Past and Future Agricultures. As many of you will know, the Museum of English Rural Life has a long and close involvement with AIMA, but this gathering is the first time in more than 45 years that we have hosted this Congress here at the University of Reading, certainly a first for my time as director of the museum. I was lucky enough to be a guest as part of the AIMA Executive Committee meeting visit to Slovenia in 2019, which gave me a chance to get a real sense of the shared community of interest and enjoy a very immersive and memorable few days visiting some of the country's most iconic museums and agricultural heritage sites. Yet what was equally striking was to discover that AIMA's committee represents a great diversity of museums, academic institutions, and specialist interests, and that this is an extraordinarily enduring network. Ollie has suggested that I add a few more words of introduction to the Museum of English Rural Life to help set at least the virtual context for the deliberations of the next few days. Of course, it's particularly disappointing for me that those who are joining us virtually from across the world will not be able to see the museum in person and enjoy that very particular curator's pleasure of inspecting behind the scenes each other's stores and galleries. However, I'm pretty sure that my colleagues Ollie, Isabel, Danielle, Adam, Caroline, Guy, Maddie, Tom and others who you will meet over the next few days will do their very best to provide the next best thing by providing some virtual glimpses of our collections and programmes. The Museum of English Rural Life, as Ollie has mentioned, is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. As our 51 Voices project makes clear, we are very conscious and proud of our academic origins. Established as part of the Department of Agriculture at the university, informed by an expert appreciation of the technological and cultural changes to the agricultural landscape in post-war England, we are still very much a museum that values its responsibility to preserve a record of our rural heritage and to support academic research and teaching. But in more recent years, we have very deliberately taken steps to transform ourselves, both physically in new forms of interpretation and displays, which you will see more of in the next few days, but equally in how we strive to be more inclusive in our approach to reaching new and more diverse audiences, and at the same time, how we should curate and co-curate our collections in the 21st century. We took a very deliberate decision more than 20 years ago with funding from our National Heritage Lottery Fund to reimagine the museum as a public space with a renewed focus on contributing to the cultural life of our local communities here in Reading. Further changes to our displays in 2016 and a lot of time spent challenging ourselves to develop new models of interpretation and engagement have had a major impact on how we work today. We now attract regular Arts Council England funding, for example, that underpins many of our programmes on site and increasingly digitally. This has led to a step change in the numbers and profile of our visitors and the types of creativity and engagement we enjoy with partners nationally, such as via the Rural Museums Network here in the UK, and of course internationally, such as with AIMA and initiatives such as the European Rural History Film Association. I believe that while the MERL remains true to its distinctive and unusual roots, we have remained committed to leading innovation and to the importance of sharing our experiences and learning from others, especially at events such as this Congress. I would like to express my huge personal thanks to Ollie and Isabel. I know very well how much work has gone into the planning and preparation for this Congress and the patient way they have had to adapt and change to unforeseen circumstances over the past 3 years. I'm sure that those on the committee will want to join me in this appreciation. I would also like to add a special mention of our colleague Tom Woodhouse, who has been the mastermind for the digital and technical side of our presentation. Thank you, Tom, from all of us. Without your amazing expertise, we would not be enjoying the prospect of the digital experiences that lie ahead. And finally, once again, thank you all for finding the time to be with us today and over the weekend. I think we will all have an exciting and stimulating few days to look forward to.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Isabel, for those excellent words of welcome. We just have a very brief minute before I hand over to our first session chair, Pete Watson. So I'll just take a moment just for those who have just joined us to reiterate some of the technical points that the event is being recorded. Please check your Zoom profiles in your own name. If you're not participating live, please try and keep your mic muted and your camera off. Questions can be posted in the chat and will be read to panelists on your behalf. If there are any issues with those, the chair may invite you to speak live. Where pre-recorded presentations have been received in good time, we'll be posting the links to the YouTube videos in the chat. So please look at the video posted in the chat by me earlier during my welcoming remarks for a short introduction to how to access the subtitled translations via YouTube. We're bang on time, and I'm very pleased to be handing it over to my AIMA Executive Committee colleague, Pete Watson, a director of Howell Living History Farm in the US. And he'll be presiding over a session entitled New Approaches to Museums of Farming. And I'll leave it to Pete to introduce that session now. I'll just have to find him and provide him access to the session. 1 second. Pete, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Before introducing you to our session on new approaches to museums of farming and to our panel of truly wonderful speakers, I'd like to share just a very brief farm report from my own museum in New Jersey, USA, where yesterday we saw 2 school buses full of school children arrive in our parking lot for the first time in 16 months. It was great to see because although we've been able to farm and to use our crops to help local food banks and pantries during the pandemic, we are at heart as much educators as we are farmers, and we are incomplete without those who pass through our gates to watch us plow a field or harvest a crop, or who themselves take up that plow or plant the seed or put on a husking peg. Their desire to learn about the food we eat and the history that can help farmers grow enough of it sustainably to feed everyone is what sustains us. We're grateful to be in the business we're in and to have friends, colleagues, and partners like you and like the speakers you are about to meet. The first of whom is Winani Tebele, the Chief Curator and Head of Ethnology at the Botswana National Museum, where she is the vision and energy behind a project that uses history, art, and agriculture to explore the impact of colonial farming on practices used and continuing to be shaped today. Her presentation on the Burnington colonial legacy is instructive, inspiring, and a fitting beginning to a conference on past and future agricultures. Following Dr. Tebele's presentation, we are going to learn about the creation of a new national museum being developed by Sarka, the Finnish Agricultural Museum, whose curator, Elsa Hayatala, will take us behind the scenes of a fascinating initiative and the critical relevance it brings to a field of agricultural history. We then go to Bob Clark, the director of Akandrean Township Museum and the Regional Museum, whose approach to site-specific agricultural history continues to enrich and inform the work of the UK Rural Museums Network, a network he chaired for many years. His presentation provides an insightful look at an approach that can be instrumental in the planning of historic sites and a key to the research and interpretation essential to them. Finally, we will have the pleasure of meeting Benjamin Sin, whose work has guided the creation of a new heritage center around the history of a dairy company founded in 1886 to bring healthy, affordable milk to the community. The compelling story is about the quality of life born of a community's embracing of its history and heritage, a fitting way to close our session on past and future agricultures. In all, our session will take us to 3 continents and introduce us to colleagues whose exemplary work is shaping the future of the museums we love. It is truly a pleasure and honor to help host this session and to welcome all of you as we turn the first furrows of AIMA's 19th Congress.
Good morning or afternoon to you all. I'm Dr. Winani Tebele from the Botswana National Museum in Botswana. We are going to talk about the Burnington Farm project in Botswana. It is in Gaborone, the capital city. It's based on a colony, it's a colonial project really. Burnington was part of farms that formed the early Gaborone. Gaborone is the capital city. By then, the capital, the country, the protectorate was run from Mafeking, not in Botswana. So Gaborone was just a small station really, and just villages around. And Burnington is one of the farms, part of land that was given by Kosi Sichele, a local chief, to the British South Africa Company for the railway line from Cape to Cairo as per his dream. It was also to act as a buffer zone because Botswana chiefs were afraid that the Boers that were moving from down south, from Cape Town up north, and establishing republics were going to take over Botswana. So Sicily decided to give this stretch of land to white people along the railway line. So Burnington was part of those farms. The farm was used for livestock and crops. In around 1975, most of these farms were taken over by government. They were bought by government now to create space for the expanding capital city, Gaborone. And the Burnington project that we are doing is now part of the remnants of the Burnington farm, which is, these farms were called Broadhurst farms. It was around the 1800s. The first owner of the farm was then Lecordia, and I think it exchanged many owners over the years, but the last owners were the Saunders, who are still here in Botswana, but have now moved into different business. And most of the local residents, the local communities around Gaborone worked at the Burnington farm, particularly Mokhodisane. Mokhodisane is now has been swallowed up by the capital city. They worked at the Burnington farm and at the Burnington trading store. There was a trading store run by the owners of the Burnington farm. They also fetched water from the boreholes from this farm. The key pointers that still remain up to today are the silos, which you would see in the picture, and the farmhouse and horse stables. They still remain. Those are being redeveloped. The silos have been repainted, and those are going to be like the key exhibits in the open air museum. We chose the Burnington farm to act as an open air museum because of these audio exhibits that I've already mentioned. There is also other things that are displayed there. The physical structures, there's going to be in the farmhouse after restoration, there will be other things that will be displayed inside, like small objects. And we also chose this because it's going to be easy to portray history, the culture of the adjacent communities, and also contemporary settings. This is going to impart knowledge to the general public, to tourists, for pleasure, appreciation of the history, the colonial history, and the lifestyles of the represented communities, that is the Mokhodisane community and the many other surrounding communities. It's going to offer an opportunity to show local designs like traditional architecture, the vegetation, material, and the uses that vary according to the different ethnic groups that are in the geographical area. Also, the constructed structures that we are going to have in the open air museum will be like representing the farm itself and the traditional structures from the local communities, so that we show the blending of the foreign culture that was coming in with the farmers and the local culture. The performance of cultural practices by the local communities. The Burnington Open Air Museum is going to also portray the history of colonial Gaborone, in particular with the emphasis on the Burnington farm itself, but also the other farms and the colonial developments that were there during the time, because it was a station, because that was the time of the construction of the road to the north, which is the railway line. So it's going to show the early structures by the colonial government then. It is also an opportunity to conserve and preserve cultural, natural, and historical heritage, and also to extend the green belt of Gaborone, because around the Burnington silos and Burnington farm, there's a stream that runs through the site. So the intention is to rehabilitate the area such that the greenery from the stream is also a feature that shows in the open air museum. And since the stream runs through the whole city, we feel it's going to like extend the green belt of the city. It also goes all the way through to the botanical garden, which is a part of the Botswana National Museum. So hence the component of the greenery of the city. It's also going to contribute to tourist attraction in the city, since there are very few, the main areas for recreation in the city, just shopping centers. There's really a few features that would attract people from outside. Therefore, it's going to add to places of leisure and to act as an educational outlet. The farmhouse is going to act as the key exhibit as well as the silos. The project is going to be phased out. It will start with the boundary wall, and then the museum is also going to be realized through collaborations with different stakeholders, particularly those whose history is linked to the features that were a part of early Gaborone then and the Burnington silos. We've devised a strategy where we say we are finding the stakeholders are coming in to find the missing link to their history. One of the displays is going to be a railway station within the open air museum, because it was a main feature then the post office and trading stores. So we are going to approach all these stakeholders that are a part of the early hotels and Gaborone, the hotels and Gaborone, to say, you know, this is where you are coming from. This is Gaborone Hotel, which used to be a hotel then, but then it's a modern kind of facility. But we are going to approach them to say, can you help us reconstruct this, because it's a part of your history. Hence the issue of finding the missing link and restoring and displaying together. This is also a call to promote and preserve the history of Gaborone with the stakeholders, and also for them to help fund the restoration process of the Burnington Open Air Museum. The other thematic historical displays will be focusing on the farm implements, farm animals, early post office, Burnington trading store, and other trading stores that were in the area. We are also thinking of establishing a nature park within the Burnington, because there is ample space there. Burnington is also going to have an amphitheater. That is a space where there will be a lot of activities, the display of traditional dances, you know, games and many other things, and probably for the visiting school groups that will be visiting the open air museum. There's going to be daily feeding activities and nurturing of animals and plant species, watching of the riding horses, because we also have stables. We'll also create space within the amphitheater made for seminars, lectures on restoration and craftsmanship, and other farm activities. We see this as a lifelong learning process, which can lead to social and as well as economic stability within the society, promoting of culture and heritage, leading to social harmony, because we want to promote all the different communities, so that they all see themselves as being represented. This is also going to eradicate poverty, because within the different structures, we are also going to allow the local communities to come and practice their traditional skills, and also sell in the curio shop or within their given spaces. So this will lead to economic diversification through all these different cultural industries. This will also lead to the broadening of the tourism base, because in Botswana mostly tourists come to see wildlife, wild animals, they visit national parks. So with an open air museum based on a colonial history like this one, we see it as another component for tourism. It's also going to promote craft skills and their production, and this could also lead to non-sport talent search, because in most cases what happens in Gaborone is people go and watch football. The skills promotion at the open air museum also will be used to brand Botswana, to act as a cultural nerve point for Gaborone, and serve as a base for TV art, on ethnographic and historical documentaries, and cultural art and educational programs. The Open Air Museum will open room for partners and collaborations and exchange programs and capacity building for craft producers as well as museum professionals. It will also allow for sale of curios and in-house production by these local vendors. The Open Air Museum will also allow for production and sale and access to interpretative literature, because there is also going to be an information center within the facility. The Open Air Museum will also allow for sporting activities in the nature and fitness park, and also the horses that will also be seen moving around, and with school kids maybe learning how to ride. And it will also allow for recreation through the coffee shop and the curio shop. So in summary, we see the Burnington colonial legacy being relived through the project in conserving and restoring the farm heritage. Artists have also been invited to do their murals still on the history of farming, which you see in the picture of the silos. So it is really a critical analysis of colonial farming in Botswana, its impact on the local communities, and how it informed the current agricultural practices of the local society, and how sustainable this colonial legacy has been to the local communities. Thank you.
Sarka is the Finnish National Museum of Agriculture, situated in Loimaa, southwestern Finland. Sarka is surrounded by the most fertile agricultural land, and the region's economy and industry also greatly depend on agriculture. The museum was established in 2005, and the idea for this museum came from local people. Though Sarka is managed by a private foundation, it is categorized as the National Museum of Agriculture, and it is also partly funded by the Finnish state.
The museum's collections consist of agricultural tools, machines and other items, as well as photographs, archives and literature. The museum also seeks to record current agriculture and its changes to future generations.
The most visible part of Finnish Agricultural Museum's work are the exhibitions, situated in 3 big exhibition halls and in the outdoor areas surrounding the museum. The exhibition Age of Agriculture presents the story of farming in Finland through people, cultivation, as well as domesticated animals and landscape. The exhibition shows how people have earned their everyday bread from the prehistoric times to the modern days in the northernmost agricultural country in the world. Before Machines exhibition focuses on traditional agriculture in Finland. The exhibition is based on the collections of the former Museum of Agriculture of the University of Helsinki.
This exceptional collection was salvaged from a vast mold contamination and placed in a new location here at Loimaa. This exhibition presents tools, implements, vessels, containers and other objects used in Finland in the 18th century. The items are mostly made from wood.
Along with work that took place in the fields, the exhibition presents animal husbandry, work in the farmhouse and the farmyard, and the additional livelihoods of hunting, fishing, forestry and various handicrafts. The 3rd exhibition hall is reserved for the history of mechanization and machinery. The exhibition is currently being renewed and modified to become a comprehensive and versatile representation of the role of machines in agriculture and a space for learning through multifaceted modern methods. Sarka has taken considerable digital advantages during the last few years, and a great part of its collections and also exhibitions are now accessible online. During the COVID-19 pandemic, digitalization and remote activities such as guided tours and workshops have become very popular, especially among schools.
Recently, the Museum of Agriculture has also strengthened its focus on food under the Food Museum concept. The events, exhibitions, tours, workshops, and online content produced under the Food Museum allow people to explore food and food production from different perspectives.
Current global challenges in climate, food production, and consumption increase the need for the museum to present the impact of the food choices we make. Sarka wants to bring historical perspective to this conversation. The Finnish Agricultural Museum Sarka cooperates with the leading agricultural research centers and universities to provide more topical contents to its permanent and temporary exhibitions and events. The museum also works as an expert organization, consulting for different scientific projects, media, and ordinary people. Sarka collects, preserves, and presents the history of agriculture while following the current events and phenomena. Knowing your history makes the future. Sarka, the Finnish Museum of Agriculture, was granted the 2021 Finnish Museum of the Year prize.
In the second part of my presentation, I will shortly discuss some challenges and possibilities of agricultural museums, especially in Finland. We still have a lot of small collections and private museums at the countryside holding big amounts of important historical objects. They preserve the local variety of different tools and machines that are impossible to fit in any museum's collections. Many of these private collections and also local museums are situated in museally poor conditions. Also, their caretakers are getting old, and all of their posterities are not keen on proceeding with their work. Under insufficient supervision, great accidents may happen. Our museum has established a network for private and local museums called Museologies. It provides information and support to small museums that might not have professional staff. It also maintains Unite web pages and publishes shared brochures to help these museums in their marketing. The challenge is to preserve the most valuable items and histories from the private and local collections and to make them attractive enough for future generations. The possibility, on the other hand, is the interest shown by the public under these post-pandemic times in countryside resorts and simple self-sufficient life. Agriculture and food. The idea to the newest addition to our museum, the Food Museum, came from AIMA 2017 conference in Tartu. Especially I have to thank Kerry Lee, whose Canadian example was really inspiring, and also our museum's management, who instantly owned the idea. We received funding to create the Food Museum concept inside our museum's existing exhibitions. The project has brought the idea of agriculture as part of the food production chain closer to people who have otherwise been alienated from its meanings. The Food Museum concept has given us new audiences and visitors, as well as a lot of positive publicity. The challenge here is that we are too few in our permanent staff to keep this new branch up to date when the project is now about to end. So it would be crucial to maintain the funding and find more resources. There are still many possibilities concerning food, as the global problems in the moment of crisis give a huge meaning to understanding food production and its origins. Accessibility. Accessibility has been an important issue for all of our relatively new exhibitions. Different client groups has been taken into consideration in designing our exhibitions and other actions. Accessibility of museum collections has also been an international issue, also stately supported, in which our museum has been involved from very early stages. There are many kinds of challenges here. The sudden closing up of the world last year created also a new situation to the museums. How to maintain your public and customers when they are not allowed to leave their homes. A fast digitalization of the exhibitions took place. We also had a bit of luck here. When we were nominated as a candidate in the Museum of the Year contest, it also provided us the possibility to get our exhibition accepted as one of the first in Finnish digital museum project. The result is displayed online. The fast development in digitalization is also a challenge in keeping up, especially on collection catalogs. New platforms are being produced all the time, better, faster, and more up to date. The projects are large and expensive, and many times the programs and apps are already old-fashioned when they are finally published. The possibilities on the digitalization continue to be great. To get to visit places, countries, and museums otherwise inaccessible online from your home couch is a huge opportunity. The future technologies most certainly add even more experiences to the remote visitors in our museums. Still, I would give all the digital advices surrounding me this moment if only I could be with you live at reading right now. Let's hope it will be possible soon. Thank you for listening.
Matin dra, agus velcha. Is Misha rebest machacleric, Stewardship and Sustainability Akandrean. Good morning and welcome. I'm Bob Clark, Director of the Museum at Akandrean Historic Township. I spoke first in the dialect of Scottish Gaelic used in Argyll, of which we are very proud. The thorny field of my title comes from that. Translated into English, Akandrean is the field of the blackthorn, Thornfield. Akandrean is a 9-hectare historic site that's been a museum since the 1960s. It's in Argyll, a rural area in the west of Scotland, about 120 kilometres northwest of Glasgow. The site is internationally significant, and let me explain why. Across parts of Northern Europe, the medieval period saw farming undertaken by small communities where people worked the land together as joint tenants rather than serfs bound to the landowner. In Scotland, these townships, as they were called, were for 1,000 years the main non-urban settlement type in a stable social order. However, by the 18th century, their farming methods and way of life blocked the improved agriculture arising from new scientific understandings. The people of the townships were held to be unwilling and unable to modernise, so change was imposed by the landowners. Between 1780 and 1880, almost all of Scotland's over 4,000 townships were improved out of existence. This was the Highland clearances, a process of evictions, displacement of people, and forced immigration, which sadly has parallels in the past of many nations within AIMA. A few isolated survivors hung on after 1900 by adopting the principles of improved agriculture, by the 1930s, just one remained, Akandrean. The end for this township came in 1963, when the son of the last tenant chose not to go into farming. By then, the importance of the site as a sole survivor had been recognised, and a charity was formed to care for it in preservation and to run it as a museum. And here we are, nearly 60 years later. In the early years, the plan was for Akandrean to be a farming museum for the whole of the west of Scotland. But this didn't work very well. With the resources available and the limitations of the site, a distinct and interesting story could not be told. The museum could have been almost anywhere. So in 2009, we changed our approach and Akandrean became a museum of itself. Since then, we have said, Akandrean was the last township. Understand this place, and through it as the type example, you will appreciate every other township that ever was. Maybe at some future point, Akandrean could broaden out to tell more of the story of the other townships, but almost all that remains of them are a few stones, bits of broken pottery, and some archival records, material for a book rather than a museum display. For now, we focus on our own story, which has been researched in great detail and which we continue to investigate. We talk most about the period since the 1750s, when good historical records start to be available, and particularly look at the years between the 1870s and the 1960s, where we have rich resources. We tell the stories of each individual building and how it evolved, including the house that became a barn and the barn rebuilt as a house. We explain how the people of the township, the Draenich, lived and worked from day to day in the tough and hostile environment of the Scottish Highlands. Where we have first-hand memories or stories from the past, we share them with visitors. One of these stories is about Isabel McCallum, always known by her Gaelic nickname of Beal Pole, Bella on the Bank. She lived by the stream that runs through the township. In her extreme old age, she lived to 93, a teenage girl from the next village came to visit her. "Come away in," said Bella. "Would you like a cup of tea and a pancake?" "Oh, yes, please," said the girl. So Bella got busy over the fire. But the fire was too hot and the pancakes started to burn, so in a fluster, Bella picked up the griddle and tipped the pancakes onto the bed nearby, next to the cat, which was having kittens. When the pancakes had cooled a bit, Bella reached under the bed for a jar of butter and buttered the pancakes with her finger. Ah, those were the days before food hygiene rules. As our visitors go round, we draw them close in to the lives of the Draenich. Domestic tasks, washing, shopping, peat for the fires, cattle and horses in the byre next to the kitchen, sheep on the hill, and salted mutton stored in the big barrel outside. Each summer, we also host Scapalue, a group who preserve the work songs used by the women who worked by hand to shrink and soften the newly woven lengths of tweed off the hand looms present in most townships. We take a multi-period approach, and one very special item in our collections is the Ferguson TEF tractor, which was at Akandrean in the early 1960s. Here it is at work, making hay the old way with a finger bar mower. Above all, everywhere the visitor goes within Akandrean, they are filled with the sense and the knowledge of the real people who spent their lives in the township. We know who they were, where they lived, and what they did. Here, from the 1920s, are some of the Munro family, and what a strange mix of things they are holding. A shotgun, the cat, a milk can, and a bunch of vegetables. Do you think they were farmers? Here, from the 1890s, is Neil McGugan with his wife and daughter. Neil wasn't a farmer and spent most of his working life in the nickel mines nearby. In retirement, he turned his hands to building dry stone walls and was still working at the age of 77. Here's Eddie McCallum III, the last tenant, ridging potatoes in the spring of 1960. And here, from the 1880s, the Draenech are out helping with the harvest. At the head of the horse is Eddie McCallum II, the last tenant's father. Now to the township's wash house in the 1880s. Washing and drying clothes and bedding must have been such hard work. And from the 1940s, the McCallum family driving home the harvest. Back to 1936, and we see old Duncan Munro the stonemason, with his son Callie and, all smart in jacket and tie, the cattle feed salesman. Back again in time to the 1880s to meet Eddie McCallum I, whose son and grandson we have already seen. And now forward to the winter of 1960-61 and Eddie McCallum III with his horses Polly and Rona. This, one of only 4 known colour photographs of the pre-museum township, was taken by a passing American tourist. Several months later, a print arrived in the post, but they never knew who sent it. Back now to 1952, to meet Eddie McCallum IV, always, even now, known as Young Eddie. Note in the background, built into a wall, a knockstone for taking the husks off grains of barley, which by then could have been 500 or even 1,000 years old. And finally in this sequence, a rather older Young Eddie and his wife Christine with the next 2 generations. Their son Neil, who works as the museum's building surveyor, with his wife Kat holding baby Finn, the 6th generation of Akandrean McCallums. At Akandrean, we confidently preserve the heritage of a community and a culture often hidden from history, the Gypsy Travellers. Way back in time, many of the townships, with their small populations, simply could not have coped at busy times without the support of the travellers. They came on a seasonal cycle when they knew they would be needed, the same families every year. They set up camp, stayed till the work was done, and then moved on to the next place where they were expected. Every year, to acknowledge and celebrate the integral part they played in the township's life and economy, we put up a traveller summer camp, a structure of hazel wands tied together with rags and covered in canvas, which the travellers call a bough camp or galley, and if the visitors are lucky, on a sunny day they will find one of the traveller women sitting on a bank and making flowers out of coloured tissue paper. Time now to conclude. There are those who might argue that our treatment of the subject matter has resulted in nothing more than an interesting local museum, and that we have turned our backs on the chance to present the full and rounded story of a key aspect of Scotland's history, the townships. We disagree. We argue that by elevating the sole survivor into the type example, and by exposing visitors to the gritty reality of township life, we have created something far more memorable than a wider overview in less depth and with greater dependence on traditional museum interpretation. Shall we, however, leave the final verdict to our visitors?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce the Pufferland Farm project to all of you, members of AIMA. The project is a community-driven movement on revitalizing the old Hong Kong Dairy Farm heritage site. This is a joint venture of Curator Hong Kong and the Portland Village Cultural Landscape Conservation Limited. I'm Benjamin Sin. I've joined Curator Hong Kong and worked with grassroots communities for almost 20 years, in particular having spent 11 years in the Portland Village. Next to me in the photo was a group of excited people who are artists, engineers, surveyors, architects, and many Portland villagers who have powered the movement in the past decade. The photo was taken in front of my old office 2 years ago on the day of groundbreaking of the revitalization works. The village house has been the base of our neighborhood level community development project, a government surveillance service designed to support underprivileged community on building social capitals and to empower the residents to enhance their livelihood collectively. The village has a population of 2,800 and covers an area of 4.2 acres. This dense horizontal community brings people together with intensive interactions. The villagers know their neighbors for generations and they have built trusting relationships with one another. The village looks like a squatter housing area and sometimes even deemed as an urban slum. But after engaging with the oldest families who have been living on this piece of land for generations, we know that the village has a history of almost 300 years, believed to be established in 1730. The village is too different from the usual Hong Kong impression, which depicts a metropolitan packed with high-rise buildings, be them commercial or residential, that 7.5 million people are filled into this vertical space leading relatively isolated lives. The village is valuable for she preserves an alternative way of living, which allows the urban people to enrich themselves with. The village is also located close to the first ever freshwater reservoir in the city, which together with its running streams forms the nowadays only eco-corridor on the Hong Kong Island West. Going back to 1817, European trading fleets carrying entrepreneurs usually supplied themselves with fresh water from this island with only barren rocks. This waterfall marked the first page of the history of Hong Kong. Behind the hill next to the waterfall, there is the Burnington Valley. I'm sure that some of the speculators being illustrated on the shore were Portland villagers. They might have lived in this row of 18 houses, which could still be found on the main street of the Portland village. The village is the last surviving one on Hong Kong Island. This historical settlement has transformed herself through agricultural, industrial, and cultural development. Her population has grown tenfold due to the establishment of the Hong Kong Dairy Farm, which reached the peak after World War II when everyone came to town to seek job opportunities in the labor-intensive industry and take refuge in the village. The dairy farm, founded by Sir Patrick Manson since 1886, had a herd of nearly 1,000 dairy cattle contained within a single area of 240 acres. By 1920, the farm was claiming to have the highest density of cattle per acre in the world. The farm surrounded the Sutherland village and became a significant part of the life of every villager. In the course of collecting villagers' oral histories, I was given a blurred picture of the late cowboy Zhang Gao with a calf leaning over to him. When I turned the photo over, it writes in Chinese, "In memory of my son," written by Zhang Gao himself. I was deeply moved by this picture and the inscriptions. It shows the profound connection between the local cowboy with the calves he was taking care of, and it somehow reflects the same profound connection between the Sutherland community with the dairy farm. In 2014, the Hong Kong government put the Bremer, the last surviving senior staff quarters of the dairy farm built in 1887, under the Revitalizing Historical Building through Partnership scheme. The Sutherland villagers sought support from the Curator's Hong Kong to make the application for the scheme, which provides capital work and startup cost budget for the operating non-profit organization. The collaborating partners named the new project as the Sutherland Farm. The villagers organized themselves voluntarily in interest groups and start formulating and implementing plans and programs for public engagement. They have run dozen tours, exhibitions, cultural activities, and craftsman workshops for over 50,000 people in the past 7 years. They want people from larger Hong Kong society to be humble and grateful for what is given to us by the nature. To be proud to inherit the collective wisdom crystallized as traditional culture. And to appreciate the fact that we need one another to participate together in making our cohabitat a better place for us to live in. We revitalize not only heritage, not just the cultural landscape. We are actually revitalizing the way of living in rural communities, not for reminiscence, but to recapture the traditional attitude of respecting the nature, the neighbors, and oneself. Taking reference from the Arts Council England's generic social outcomes, the project will focus on promoting health and well-being, strengthening public life, and building stronger and safer communities. The Sutherland Farm will become a museum without wall, being the portal to the historical cultural landscape, channeling visitors to the scattering heritage sites and turning the whole Sutherland Valley into a living museum. An internally driven community could usually gain much support from external stakeholders. For instance, the Sutherland Farm has already been supported by a private foundation, filling us with 2.8 million Hong Kong dollars to initiate a training program for the successors. In summary, the project aims to connect people living in Sutherland neighborhoods with inner peace, purposes, people, place, past, and present, bring strength and coherence to drive individuals to structure, implement, and promote a community-based model of sustainable, reciprocal, and hopeful living. The build works for the heritage conservation has already been completed lately. The project will launch in October 2021 and grand opening in the first quarter of the next year. You are most welcome to visit the site when we are free to travel again. This is my presentation and thank you so much for having me to present in this conference. May I wish you all well and healthy. Thanks.
Thank you all for your presentations about your cutting edge work at 4 extraordinarily inspiring museums. Ones that are certainly on my must visit list, and I would imagine on the lists of many, if not all, of our colleagues gathered today. We have a number of questions that have been posed during your presentations, and we'll ask those that apply generally to all of you and ask that you respond to those. If we have time, we'll then address some that have been asked about, specifically about some of the projects you've described. And in the event that we do run out of time, we'll make sure that those of you who have asked those questions are in touch with the presenters and are able to get a response. And please feel free to continue to add your questions to the chat. We have 10 minutes. We hope to not go into our break time, but maybe we will. Let's see. We have a question from Isabel Hughes of the MERL, and this is to all. Isabel says, listening to the presentation so far, food production is a truly global story. Should we be presenting more of that connected story, or are we best placed to focus our own local variations and traditions? Panelists, can you share your thoughts with Isabel and all of us?
I'll happily start off if you want, Pete.
Thank you, Bob.
I think there's a place for both. There is an increasingly so an argument that the world needs to better understand food production, how it happens, its impact on the planet, its impact on people, the global inequalities that there are. And there is an argument for agriculture and those museums that reflect the past of agriculture to present an integrated message. That said, the national, regional, local differences are significant and can help hugely with a sense of place and community and purpose and identity. I was very impressed with Benjamin Sin's analysis of how something that starts out as agriculture has regenerated into a community identity, a community strengthening initiative. Maybe there's a message in that for all. So I think my answer to Isabel will be, in different circumstances, for different purposes, we actually need both approaches.
Thank you very much, Bob. Other panelists, any comments?
Yes. Oh, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I think much as we have our own unique stories representing our different localities or countries or continents, it is important that we show the link, because as museum, we really have to find commonalities, you know, where we, like she's saying, it looks like a global story that is affecting us all. So it is really important to bring that out so that we see the link between the different displays of culture and our traditional ways of making foods, or yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
You know, both of these responses make me think of the somewhat related question that that Ollie has posed, and that is also to all. And the way he asks it is, to what extent are you working, or I'm sorry, are there different roles for agricultural museums in relation to the local, national, and international spheres? And how do each of these different strands or focal areas of work play out in your different contexts?
I would like to add a few notes from a perspective of urban people. I'm so impressed to see your presentation that to know more and more people are cherishing the history and the way how we produce food for our people. But I'm coming from a metropolitan from Hong Kong of 7.5 million people living in this city. And actually our food self-sufficient rate is as low as being 10%. And we have only 6% of our land being used as a agricultural purpose. So the difficulties for me to run this museum is like telling other story. Telling only the stories from the past. I tell the Hong Kong people how we had 3,000 cows, dairy cattle, giving us everyday's milk. And even in my generation, I enjoyed dairy farms, ice cream on weekends. And this was the wonderful moment when we are all from grassroots families. But nowadays we consume 250 million kilograms of dairy products a year, and we have any milk dairy production happening in Hong Kong. So I think it's really a story that we need to tell my people, that food is actually being given by the nature, by very hardworking farmers, by fertile soils, and by and being blessed that we have animals to do our works. And so I think it somehow is I envision as a attitude change for people living in cities, and especially at the time when we are seeing how cities will fall apart in the coming century, when we are faced with natural disaster and food crisis.
Can I follow on there, Pete?
I'm sorry. Yes, Bob.
Yeah. The perspective I bring from Akandrean is that our very holistic view at agricultural communities serves a role in educating the modern world about food production, which from my generation, I still don't believe how necessary it is, but I have learnt that it is necessary. What are those green things? Those are potatoes growing. Do they grow in the ground? Where do eggs come from? From the supermarkets. And the complete jaw-dropping wonder when we clip a sheep and we go through the process of explaining, see, you're wearing a jumper that's made of wool. Now it started off like that, and then we did this to it, this to it, this to it, this to it, and that ended up as a jumper. And the modern world, and I'd be very interested to find out to what extent this is true in the other countries, but certainly in modern Scotland, whether they are country dwellers or town dwellers, they don't know by and large, where food comes from, because in a way that was not true in the past that we represent. People and the food production process have become completely separated from each other.
I can't agree more with you, and it makes me recall an opportunity that my wife and I had to attend the annual conference of Australian museum educators and farmers and government officials. The entire focus of that conference was on the importance of teaching those lessons about where food and fiber comes from to all generations, but beginning with preschoolers. I was shocked to think that that's where this begins, but as I think about my own children, how did they begin? And it gave me an immediate shock, thinking how many times I had thought poorly of those who came to our museum, esteemed as it is, and who wanted to pet an animal. How can a human being begin in any other way than through those kinds of encounters? I have a very different opinion now about what our job is, especially after listening to all of you. Elsa, I saw you shaking your head. Yes, in acknowledgement of all of this. We do still have a bit of time here, so if any other panelists would like to comment here, it's still very appropriate.
Yeah, I also agree with you entirely, Clark, about particularly the young generation. Honestly, when we were presenting our concept of the Burnington Open Air Museum and talking of having live animals in the farm, our superiors at the beginning were shuddering. How do you think this will be allowed? You know, and we were like, this is very important because we want the young people to see the milking, actual milking of the cow, of the goat, and it's not a whole lot of cattle that are going to come in, just 4 or 5, just for educational purposes. Because they eat the egg, the young people eat the egg, they enjoy the milk, but they don't even know where it's coming from. We even have a small section where we plow using the ox-drawn plow, so that there is a few things, ground nuts, maize, and so they see how it is when it's still in the field. Because otherwise, most people, and like you are saying, Watson, it's not only the young people from kindergarten, even my age, those who grew up in the towns, they enjoy the eggs, they enjoy the milk, they enjoy so many things, but they don't know how they are manufactured, how they're done, you know, from when they are still, you know, in the farm. So it is really important. It's a lifelong learning process for people so that they appreciate what they see in the shop and know where it's coming from. I mean, I work as a professional in the city, but I also have a farm somewhere where I do my stuff so that my kids can learn, can know some of these things. And when it comes to school and they have lessons where they are asked all these questions, they are always excelling. They tell me, teachers are always asking, but how did you know about all this? Because I wanted them to know, to see, to have first-hand experience. So I think it is important, and these museums are really, really, really important, very critical, because otherwise we are having a generation that is like just seeing the end products and not really knowing nothing about, you know, the whole process of, you know, getting to have something in your mouth. Thank you.
Wonderful comments and thoughts following excellent presentations. We're now into our break period. However, with Dr. Douglas's and Isabel's permission, I think we'll continue for just 1 more minute with a question that is posed to you, Wenani. Are you working with local farmers and farming agencies as well as with local communities and artists? And if so, what role are they playing in your project?
Yes, we are working with local farmers and communities. These adjacent communities that have been like a part of the growing city, who have now been swallowed up by the city, but they are still visible. And that's where we got most of the information about these colonial farms. And we work with them. They are like, it's called curation of the developments that are inside the museum. They work as guides in the open air museum. And we also work with the University of Agriculture, which is also a part of in the city, with the grooming of the animals that we have in the open air museum, the chickens, the cows, and the other small farm animals. And then the artists who did the mural paintings on the silos, we have it's a branch of the National Museum. We call them the Tapong Visual Arts Center. They brought young artists, and they were paid by the Ministry of Agriculture, because we also brought them in to say this is for educational purposes for our young people. So we want to depict some of the displays on the. So they paid the young artists to do the murals. So it's like it's a community kind of project. There's a lot of stakeholders participating and even funding some of the developments. And I'm hoping that after COVID, some of you will be able to visit Botswana and visit the open air museum. Botswana is a tourist destination. We have the Okavango Delta, which is a World Heritage Site. We also have the Tsodilo Hills. It's also a World Heritage Site. But then people would normally just fly over the city, the capital city, into the Delta, to see the wild. But we want to create a stop in the capital city so that people come here for at least a night or so and see what we have, this learning facility here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wenani, and all panelists. I've managed to save 7 minutes of our break time. I want to thank all of you for your wonderful presentations. Remind you that all of these can be seen on YouTube. I think Ollie can elaborate on that for us, but thank you all for allowing me to be your chair during this session. It's certainly been my pleasure. I commend you and the work you're doing, and wish you all the best throughout the conference. Thank you so much. Ollie?
Thank you, Pete. That's wonderful. I'll add my thanks to all our speakers for this first session. That was absolutely fascinating, a really engaging start to proceedings. I'm afraid we had some slight technical challenges with sharing of the presentation, so I hope everyone was able to see and hear those as best as possible. We're about to break. I'll suggest that we run 5 minutes over with the break, so we all have 10 minutes rather than the 6 minutes that are left. I think we might be running a little behind schedule throughout, but if we reconvene at what would be 2:20 in the afternoon British summertime, and whatever that is wherever you are in the world, that'll give us a chance to either get a hot drink if you're in a cold country like Wenani, or a cold drink if you're in a very hot country at the moment like I am. We'll also be playing in the chat a short welcome introduction to the welcome case at the museum, and I'll play that live through the break, but it'll also be there in the chat and a YouTube link. YouTube links will be available for all this content after the Congress, and we'll share those with participants in the Congress initially, and then we'll broaden that out to a wider cohort at a later date. But just so you know, there is a link right at the top of the chat to the running order and program and all the YouTube content. But thank you again to everyone, and thank you, Pete. We shall see you in 10 minutes' time. I'm Ollie Douglas, and I'm the curator of the Museum of English Rural Life, and we're here in the welcome area of the museum. And this is the welcome case behind me. And this contains a mixture of objects from the two big sides of the museum's collections. So we have a whole load of objects associated with heritage crafts and rural trades and industries, but we also have objects associated with agriculture and the history of food and farming. The museum was founded in 1951, so this is a fairly critical time in the development of modern agriculture and farming practice. It's a time at which the Agriculture Act of 1947 has just been passed, and big changes developed during the war, but gaining pace after that period, are coming in to make a major change to the countryside and the way in which people are living and farming in that space. So the collections that lie in the galleries beyond help chart and tell that story in various ways, and they do so in relation to those changing practices around rural crops and trades, but also changing practices in relation to agriculture. 1951 is also a key date for us for several other reasons, the first of which is represented by this piece of straw craft, a shepherd's crook, made for display at the Festival of Britain, which was a major Reconstruction Britain event, developed post-war as a way of promoting Britain and its industries, including agriculture and the farming economy, to the wider world. We also have connections to the history of the Archers. So the Archers, the first national broadcast episode of this famous farming BBC radio serial, was broadcast on exactly the same day that the first object was accessioned into the museum's collections, the 1st of January 1951. And the interesting thing about the Archers is that it was developed as a way of promoting contemporary and future farming techniques and processes to the farming community. So a way of looking forward, a forward-thinking way of thinking about the countryside. And the museum is in some ways the counterpoint to that, a way of looking to the past and understanding the ways in which we got to that point. So these collections behind me and in the galleries beyond allow us to talk about those histories. But what you won't find in the galleries beyond is a timeline of agricultural and rural life. It's not a chronological sequence of objects that we have on display. So instead, above me in this welcome space, there's a light touch timeline that allows us to pick up on some of the key changes over the last 200, 250 years in rural life in England. Hello, hopefully you're all rejoining now, and I'm really pleased that we're about to start our second session. I just need to reiterate the technical points. We'll be repeating this regularly, so sorry about the repetition. The event is being recorded. Please check your Zoom profile is your name. There are a number of you who have names that we don't quite understand. It'd be good to know who you are. If you're not participating live, please try to keep your mic muted and your camera off. Questions can be posted in the chat, and these will be read to panelists on your behalf. If there are any pronunciation or clarification issues, the chair may invite you to speak on your own behalf. Where pre-recorded presentations have been received in good time, we'll be posting links to those YouTube videos in the chat. And please look at the top of the chat for a short introduction to accessing subtitle translations via YouTube. We'll try and be a little bit more prompt on those this time round. I'm really pleased to be handing over to my AIMA Executive Committee colleague, Surajit Sarkar. I'm just going to find you, Surajit, and ask you to unmute. Surajit is joining us to chair this session on climate, environment and sustainability. Surajit, incidentally, also wrote this week's contribution to our 51 Voices project. So again, there's a link right at the top of the chat to the information about that, and you should be able to track down his piece there. Surajit, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Ollie. I hope you can hear me. All right.
Absolutely perfect, Surajit. I can hear you.
Okay. Welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm just kind of trying to see whether I can see the rest of my panelists around. But till then, I'd just like to mention that this session is about climate, environment, and sustainability. Of course, sustainability and climate change is something all of us are familiar with. Hello, Cameron, I see you now. But what is interesting about the Agriculture Museum is that there are quite a few of them now which kind of have looked upon the museum not just as a collection of artifacts that tell about the effect of the role that environment and climate has played on agriculture, but also it sees its site, the site of the museum itself, for adapting to the future, for being sustainable in the future. So it's a kind of double layer of meaning, not the museum as a site itself and the museum collection as indicators of how we can interpret sustainability and the use of the environment over time. Okay, before I go any further, I'd just like to introduce my panelists. I can see Cameron here. Cameron Archer from the Australia is an agriculture and environmental historian. I cannot see any of the others, but I presume they are there. David Simmons, I see you now from the Billings Museum in the US. And Deborah Reed, I don't see her. Oops, 1 minute. Okay, I see Deborah Reed there. And she is the curator of agriculture and the environment at the Henry Ford. And let's start the session, should we? And maybe I can ask Deborah to lead. Why don't we just play your presentation first? It's a fairly short one. And in fact, we would like all three of the participants to play their presentations first. And then we have a discussion about the role of the Agricultural Museum, both as a site of sustainability, as well as holder of a collection of information about climate change and sustainability. Thank you. So Deborah, over to you. Okay, that's Cameron.
Hello, my name's Cameron Archer. I'm had a long association with agricultural history and museums in Australia. Our system in Australia is somewhat different from other countries. We're I term a settler society, so we've got two waves of habitation across our landscape: our Indigenous era and our European era. So I need to talk, when I address this theme, to talk about both of those eras. I'm now mainly involved in incorporating or supporting learning about agriculture in Australian schools as chair of the Primary Industries Education Foundation. So my focus in this address will be in the context of the theme, but also in the context of school student learning. The idea of a settler society is probably very different from European context of agricultural history and environmental history, because Aboriginal people were living across this land for 40 to 60,000 years before Europeans invaded for permanent settlement in 1788 at Sydney. So there's now a great emphasis on better understanding Aboriginal history, Aboriginal land management, especially in the context of environmental history and the Australian bushland. As you would have seen on your televisions, the Australian bush is extremely volatile in hot, dry weather and burns with the eucalypt trees and whatever incessantly in hot summers, sometimes more than others. And climate change is impacting on that. The other issue which has come to fore has been the recent publication of a book called Dark Emu Black Seeds, which is a really important book, which written by a fellow called Bruce Pascoe. It's put a great emphasis on the fact that Aboriginal people were just not hunters and gatherers, but were also were farmers and grew plants and crops And that's contested. It's very much contested. There's a lot of debate about that. So the whole philosophy of hunters and gatherers versus settled civilized societies and all sorts of things with our Judeo-Christian background come to fore on that. So that's an issue that's currently in debate in terms of land use. So when it comes to European impact on agriculture and the land, it's quite dramatic, as you know, and that the impact of European agriculture on Europe itself has been gradual, but whereas in this country it was a very stark contrast between how Aboriginal people were managing the land and how we introduced sheep and cattle and managed the land henceforth. And then we had the impact of industrial revolution, ploughing, growing crops, lots of soil erosion and land degradation, and agricultural science has now spent a lot of effort in terms of addressing those issues. How well that's articulated in agricultural museums in this country, or any museum in this country, is the issue. It's probably not articulated at all, apart from the issues that have happened as distinct from the solutions to them. And I guess that's where I'm fairly passionate about what we can do in schools about communicating the operation of modern agriculture and food production to students through the school curriculum. What I see in agricultural museums in this country, and there's no specific agricultural museum as such. There's a lot of rural museums that are largely agriculture, but they're usually just reflect the district and the equipment and things that are in the district of a very narrow time span of how things operated, often more nostalgic rather than interpretive. So we don't have the sort of great organisations like I've seen in Europe and the UK, and also know of in America, where there's greater interpretation of agriculture in a museum context. So we've got a long way to go, but we've also got a lot of challenges, and I think those challenges are just not owned by us, because I think we don't really talk about how modern agriculture works and how we've progressed with science, how we've been able to how we made a lot of mistakes with agricultural chemicals in the mid-20th century, and how we still are using agricultural chemicals extensively to produce the food that we eat, and how there's been so much research on integrated pest management and other ways of overcoming some of the issues that created by monocultures, especially genetic modification, etc. And those things are happening, but they're not necessarily discussed in the context of modern education, and also in a museum context. So I think there's much more we can do there if we're going to really assist future generations to understand how their food's produced, how it was produced, how we have worked very hard as a community and as an industry to improve and lower the impact of agricultural practices on the landscape. One of the things I see happening with the concepts of sustainability is that there seems to be an underlying feeling at times is that you can produce food and fibre without having any impact on the environment, and there's this ideal that there's no impact of undertaking these practices. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case in my view, and we're better off understanding the impacts, learning about them, and working to reduce them, rather than thinking there's no impact whatsoever. So in where my thoughts are is to do with environmental history, to do with agricultural history, and how we can better communicate what's happening in the real world to the community and also school students into the future. And I believe agricultural museums, as they're set up in other countries, and hopefully sooner or later in this country, have a major role to play, particularly with schools. So I look forward to discussing that and other matters into the future and at the conference. I haven't talked too much about climate change. I think that's worked over pretty well, and we have to deal with that in terms of how we farm into the future. So I look forward to our discussions henceforth. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Deborah Reed, Curator of Agriculture and the Environment at the Henry Ford, and I'm pleased to be part of this roundtable on climate, environment, and sustainability. I'm going to talk briefly about the effort by which farm museums can go green, and then think about objects as evidence of climate change and interpretation as a sustainable practice. There's a fair amount written about the Green Museum movement in Europe. Key Culture, KI Culture, is a new effort that's attempting to coordinate activities, share practices, and really generate a movement among museums and cultural institutions in Europe to pursue this critical work. In the US, there's a book, Green Museums, by Sarah Brophy and Elizabeth Wiley, that lays out a multi-step process by which museums can go green. It's starting with reducing utility use and emissions, and then green practices like reducing, reusing, and preservation, a green action in and of itself. Then taking the next step as advocates for cultural change, working within communities and co-creating with partners to spread the word, both within institutions and beyond. The green education component of this is the natural action of a lot of open air museums and living history farms, taking the environments in which they work and in which people visit and turning those into opportunities to teach about the human past, the past biosystems, the past agriculture, and then the ramifications of positive change for the future. Living history farms like this is Firestone Farm at the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, created based on collections of historic flora and fauna, propagation of heritage varieties, and then the conveying of those practices to the general public. It may look green, but it doesn't mean that it is practicing green in terms of thinking beyond the organic draft animal power and to the larger context of proactive interpretation of historic practices, because some of those historic practices are not necessarily organic or sustainable. Now, here's draft animals, human power, and stoop labor at work in an onion field for Heinz, a prepackaged or processing food company. But that in contrast with the Fordson tractor, an economically viable option for farmers within the context of World War I, or the row crop tractor that's introduced by the International Harvester Corporation, Cormac Deering, in 1920, late 24, early 25. These machines mark a significant change in the renewable energy use on the farm. And that change has helped bring about the Anthropocene, both in the ways that the materials in the planet, the iron ores and fossil fuels, are extracted and the void left, as well as the ways that these have lasting impressions on the planet's geological time. So these artifacts, both photographic and three-dimensional, can help educate the public about this more complex agricultural past. Just because it's a pretty picture of pears or an orchard historically doesn't mean that those were necessarily green practices or sustainable practices. So emphasizing that with a sprayer at work in an orchard, and the little Caterpillar tractor model 10 was actually designed for use in orchards. So historic artifacts as evidence of climate change, both the destructive aspects of these technologies, as well as the ways that historic technologies, for example, the plow, can be a part of organic or sustainable production when used within the context of soil science and draft or renewable energy. The process of interpretation, also think of it as a sustainable practice in that there's an experimental archaeology component to this, determining practices of the past that were based on draft animal power that relate to heritage crop production and heritage livestock husbandry, and composting as introduced in historic literature and then practiced at a time in the past and recreated for the edification of the public. So this is an introduction to farm museums, their potential as green institutions, and establishing models for sustainable practices in the future. A few resources you might consider consulting, and I'm very much looking forward to fielding questions in the conversation during this roundtable. Thank you.
Snugged tight to the base of Mount Tom, easternmost spine of the Green Mountains, its meadows bounded by the Ottaquechee River and Barnard Brook, sits Billings Farm, which for 150 years has been integrated into the near landscape of the old shire town of Woodstock, Vermont. One of Vermont's legacy farms, Billings Farm celebrates its sesquicentennial this year, and since 1983 has been a component of Billings Farm and Museum. As we inspire and engage our guests across the seasons through shared stories of Vermont's rural culture and our continued practice of responsible agriculture, we are mindful that we are heirs to the ethos of stewardship, sustainability, and conservation held and embodied in the lives and the work of the former owners of the farm property. They included George Perkins Marsh, a scholar, linguist, diplomat, and environmentalist. Referenced by David Lowenthal as the prophet of conservation, Marsh was a seminal figure in America's early conservation movement. Marsh grew to adulthood in the federal brick home fronting the farm property, seen in the center of this 1860s photo. Marsh was succeeded in property ownership by another remarkable individual, Frederick Billings, who in his youth had moved to Woodstock. In 1848, Billings traveled to California, where for the next 2 decades he would make a fortune as an attorney and real estate investor. Billings commissioned Carlton Watkins to photographically describe the grandeur of Yosemite, which had captured Billings' heart. Having witnessed the splendor of the vast, virgin, timbered landscapes of the West, Billings was dismayed at finding the hills of his beloved Green Mountains denuded of vegetation from years of overgrazing by sheep and wanton timber harvesting for lumber and potash production. But he loved Woodstock, purchased the old Marsh place on a nearby barren hillside, and over the next several decades greatly enlarged and improved the property. Inspired by the ideas of George Perkins Marsh, as espoused in his 1864 Man in Nature, Billings judiciously selected and arranged for the planting of tens of thousands of trees, from European larch, Norway spruce, and more, reforesting his Mount Tom property, all the while purposefully setting a course that other Vermonters might follow. Much of this work was under the direction of a Scot, George Aitken, who in 1884 became the 4th manager of the farm. A powerful leader who put his hand to the plow and over the next quarter century would realize Frederick Billings' vision of transforming and shaping the landscape. So enthralled with Aitken was Billings that, as an enticement to have him outlive the shorter tenure of his previous farm managers, Billings constructed a handsome and commodious farm manager's house, a centerpiece of today's museum experience. From the manager's office, Aitken managed a substantial workforce of local men who planted, sugared, built miles of carriage roads, and over the years, with teams of oxen, deepened and expanded a mountaintop spring-fed pogue hole to become an important source of water for the estate below. Still in operation today, a water motor, driven by the force of water, gravity-fed through a nearly mile-long 4-inch pipe from the pogue, powers a large Davis swing churn in the farm's creamery. The farm's gravity-fed irrigation system also connects to this early sustainable source. A studious farmer and dairyman versed in the latest progressive agricultural literature, Aiken devoted much of his energy to improving and growing the farm's herd of Jerseys, first introduced directly from the Isle of Jersey by Frederick Billings in 1871. It was Billings' intention that through sustainable and progressive practice, the farm would serve as a beacon to fellow Vermonters on how the landscape of the Green Mountain State could successfully be worked. Toward that end, farm manager Aiken participated in summer industrial school programs for teachers, instructing them in the finer points of the Jersey breed. The rhythms of harrowing, haying, and binding, George Aiken using the latest technology, a McCormick bindlow shine to increase efficiency of farm operations, was punctuated by opportunities to showcase the quality of the continually improving Jersey herd. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, for example, Aiken returned to Woodstock with a number of champions, including Princess Honoria, who was crowned the top 3-year-old cow in America. While in the 20th century, Vermont had become renowned for her Jerseys and alliteratively Morgans, Maple, and Men, it was several generations of Billings family women who, after the passing of Frederick Billings and later of George Aiken, skillfully led and expanded the farm operation. During the First World War, the farm's labor force was augmented by local young women, the Women's Land Army, or farmerettes, who, our records show, were compensated the same as their male counterparts, one of the farm's significant stories shared with today's museum goers. While the Billings herd was sold off during the Great Depression, it was rejuvenated with bloodline stock connecting with and providing a continuum to the early Billings champion herd. In 1948, the barns were upgraded, and in the years that followed, the Jersey milk was bottled on site and delivered locally. In the 1950s, ownership of the farm and estate transferred to Frederick Billings' granddaughter, Mary French Rockefeller, wife of Lawrence Rockefeller, an ardent conservationist. In 1983, Mary and Lawrence established Billings Farm and Museum, an interactive, multifaceted learning laboratory, and 15 years later, they donated the Mount Tom estate to become Vermont's only national park. Today, Billings Farm and Museum is the nation's only museum that combines the experience of a galleried and outdoor history museum with a fully functioning farm through which 60,000 visitors each year are introduced to what are becoming more and more alien concepts in today's world. Today's herd of Jerseys, more than 100 strong, and with 45 to 50 milkers, continues Billings and Aiken's legacy as one of the finest Jersey herds in the country, producing a diversified product array, important in today's economy, from fluid milk to the Agrimark Cooperative, milk to a local dairy producer, and in cooperation with a local cheesemaker, our own line of artisanal cheeses. Over the decades, the built environment of the farm has evolved from the removal of a pair of silos and 50 years later, restoring another pair as an iconic interpretive element, and to constructing a new freestall heifer barn, interpretive counterpoint to the farm's tie-stall milking barn, and more. But across the last half-century and a half, the Billings farmland has evinced a reassuring constancy. The Great Meadow, once Vermont's largest cornfield and producer of oats, now today 3 cuttings of hay for our Jerseys and draft horses. Processes and technologies have evolved from bull rakes and ox-pulled wagon to Fordsons and John Deere, Case, Kubota, and New Holland. But the contours of the land, its productivity, the openness and unspoiled vistas, thanks to foresighted scenic easements, remain largely unchanged, available for farm and museum use across the seasons. It serves as a canvas for demonstration of former technologies, and the Great Meadow and Blake Hill beyond, once the backdrop for the kitchen garden tended by the Aiken daughters, today stand watch over the farm and museum's heirloom garden, similarly located. The garden shares its produce with a local food pantry and integrates with the interpretive foodways program in the farm manager's house through both demonstration and participation. Foodways programs keyed to healthy eating and sourcing locally unfold within the museum's learning kitchen. Education gardens are active laboratories for linkages to victory gardens, children's nutrition, and pollinators. Our nearby garden shed hosts Billings backyard programs for adults, teaching traditional farming and homesteading skills for the modern day, from composting to beekeeping and the importance of pollinators, and more. The site's 10,000 square foot sunflower house, newly designed each year, is a haven for area pollinators, and a large community garden on our property serves the local populace in concert with Sustainable Woodstock, an environmentally focused nonprofit. During the summer, Ballet Vermont performs farm-focused and environmentally themed ballet at the head of our meadow. Aligned with our mission of responsible agriculture, we have in recent years shifted our remaining fields of corn to no-hay till production, which, when combined with exacting amounts of beet pulp and grain determined by our nutritionist, provide an optimum diet for our high-fat, high-protein milk and the cheese produced from it. This diet also helps control methane emissions from our jerseys, the informational context woven into an extensive interpretive program shared with our guests. Sustainable environmental practice extends across our farm and museum campus in an active compost and recycling program, and within the museum for guests and staff alike, we've initiated a pledge to use reusable water bottles rather than single-use plastic bottles, no longer available on site. All of these initiatives are resident in and an outgrowth of our strategic framework. Two primary pillars include stewardship and sustainability and farming and foodways, both intentionally linking to the legacy of environmental care and sensibility embedded within the DNA of the farm and to the future, ours and our guests. We infuse these themes into children's story activity, engaging our youngest visitors with a sensitivity to important issues. And we instill in our visitors, young and old, a better understanding of where their food comes from. This is amplified in the week-long series of junior farmer camps we host each summer, linking processes past and present. Educating and instilling hope for the next generation extends to junior invitational cattle shows we host during Dairy Month, and to our practice of welcoming college agricultural apprentices in the summer months, with 2 joining us this summer. As we continue to steward our farm property, adding our hands and voices to the hundreds of those who have visioned, toiled, and shaped this special place, we take inspiration from being part of the continuum of agricultural practice at Billings Farm, as we teach and train our young stock and engage our visitors with the understanding of how we can all participate in and enjoy a more sustainable future.
Thank you for your presentations, Cameron, Deborah, and David. In order to begin this kind of roundtable discussion, I just want to throw in an idea. Hearing the 3 presentations, 2 themes kind of just struck me. One was this whole idea about unlearning, what actually Cameron mentioned, unlearning the idea that agriculture has no environmental impact. It's something that many of us still continue to believe, and I think one of the things that agricultural museums could do is actually highlight this in some way. The other one is connected to it, of course, is about the ramification of agricultural practices. What all does it affect? A simple plow, as Deborah's presentation pointed out, and the change from the plow to something else has a deep impact on the land. And it would be good to kind of hear them and anybody else with their comments. The floor is now open. Thank you. Want to lead anybody? Deborah, you want to lead?
I'm happy to lead. That's a hugely important comment, that there's this perception that agriculture is, well, bucolic may be too strong of a word, but that it is inherently organic when it is not, never has been. I think of Carrie Lee Burchell, who I first heard say that agriculture is an unnatural act. And I think that's really important to convey. So it starts with this notion that cultivation in a place produces civilization. And so undermining the idea that agriculture is bucolic and non-intrusive really challenges the whole idea of sedentary agriculture as a foundation of civilization. It really can also destroy civilizations or totally transform them, as colonial agriculture shows. So this is a huge topic, and I think in the context of an international agricultural museum organization, we can address how to collect, preserve, and interpret that history to the best advantage for the planet.
Anybody else? Cameron, David? The rest of the audience?
Yes, I think we have to work this over and get a deeper understanding that varies so much from country to country and environment to environment. And agriculture in the Australian environment with climate change is going to have to change dramatically to remain, or dare I say, viable, sustainable, whatever you like to call it. But I don't think that understanding is shared across the community. It's seen as sort of exploitive, and it is exploitive, but I think agriculturalists on the main minimise that exploitation. Otherwise, somebody running a farm ends up with something, they end up with nothing. So that there's a whole mood or feeling across farming in this country anyway, that we have to look after our land, we have to look after our animals, we have to look after the environment, and we have to minimise use of chemicals and so on and so on. And but we still have to do all that to produce food. Australia produces enough food for its 25 million people plus another 40 or 50 million people. So we're an exporter of food and fibre. So we see ourselves very much in the game of doing that. And it's quite a large part of our export income to remain viable as an economy. So that's all there. And there's also so much change happening in structures of farms and family farms getting bigger and corporations happening, all those things. And those structures are all part of what we see look into the future. So how we as people interact with the environment continues to change. And I think that's important to acknowledge and try and get a deeper understanding of it, and we can look at where we came from, and that'll help us to work out where we go to, because we have made a lot of mistakes in this country anyway, in terms of farming, but we've also picked up on learning from those, but we're still impacting on the environment, and how we communicate that, how we manage it, is a challenge, I think, for anybody involved in agriculture, whether you're in a museum or education or public life. So it's just one of the challenges, and right across that's climate change, of course, which is hitting this country just as hard or harder than many others.
David, would you like to say something?
Sure, I would just like to say that on our piece of turf, we have purposefully made the change from planting corn to just hay fields. I mean, just as an important change for us, but that's also demonstrable to our visitors in terms of lowering the impact, the deleterious impact on the environment. Another thing that for us as a dairy farm, it's very significant is the amount of water that it takes to maintain a herd of working jerseys. I mean, each of our 100 or so jerseys consumes about 50 gallons of water a day. And so we, in the past, the water source was the Pogue, referenced in my presentation, the spring-fed pond on the mountaintop just across the way. But today we draw from a local water source, and thankfully for us here in the Northeast, it's really, the water is very plentiful. But that's another element that needs to be understood.
In fact, what strikes me hearing this is that, and you mentioned that in the presentation you made, David, about how the denuded landscape origins of Billings Farm, wanting to rebuild the landscape in a sense. And it kind of strikes the whole idea of nostalgia, agriculture, the rural life. There is a kind of circuit there that, while very strong, is also one that needs to be broken, because agriculture today, the way it's practiced in the mainstream, is no longer that kind which can even imagine to be nostalgic. I mean, we have genetically modified seeds at one level, but you have chemical agriculture for the last 50 years all over the world. And there are situations where even if the odd sole organic farmer is trying to kind of preserve a kind of sense of a kind of connection with nature, because you're so surrounded by all this unnatural aspect of agriculture, as Kerali puts it, that very soon you've got to sink unless you can get the others to see things differently. It's a very complicated thing, this whole matter of sustainability and environmental sustainability in the face of all this climate change to add to another layer. It's I think the most crucial challenge facing agriculture museums today. How do we portray agriculture? And how do we continue to portray it as something that's important to us? Food is important to us, but do we want to ignore how the school food comes? And I mean, anybody else from the audience? We still have about 10 minutes, 8 minutes. So a few questions.
Well, and if I could comment, I agree. This notion of how do you interpret this complexity will keep us in business in perpetuity, because it's both at the heart of criticisms of the current food system by food writers like Mark Bittman, who just did Animal Vegetable Junk, or Alice Waters, who in the US is linked to the slow food movement origins. She's got a new book, We Are What We Eat, a Slow Food Manifesto. And we heard in the first group of papers this commitment to using food as a vehicle to reach people, to create social safety nets and community development. There is so much potential to reach folks with all of these different messages. But to what end? And that's, I think, the gold question. To what end? How does this then engage with the production system and create a broader groundswell of questioning production systems or troubleshooting and innovating in these production systems?
Yes.
One of the issues that discussed here is the concept of social license for farming, and industries having a social license and being accepted by the community, and industries which aren't. And that's a really important issue that involved in this. The intensive industries, intensive animal industries, struggle with their social license, but people still want to have cheap chicken and pork. So, and the idea of caged birds and versus free range, all those things are always debated and legislated and so on, right through to the broadacre cropping, which is less controversial to the general public. And then you go to things like native forestry in this country, which has really struggled with social license completely, because it's sort of had some sort of land clearing issues and total clearing of landscape and impact on iconic species such as koalas, etc. So we discuss social license a fair bit in those contexts, and they vary from industry to industry, and that's another, and that's where the industries themselves have to sort of examine their practices and look at how they're perceived, and hopefully science can help that, plus attitude change, and I think that's another aspect of in this debate, which we, professional agriculturalists, professional agricultural historians running agricultural institutions, always have to have in the back of our mind what is the social licenses of the industries we represent.
Thank you. And as you were saying this, I see the question that Ollie has put up on the chat box, and it kind of resonates with what was going on in my mind. I mean, we are sitting in the COVID times, COVID-19 pandemic, and what's happening on YouTube, probably one of the largest single kinds of videos playing up food videos of all kinds. But not once do we even talk about where this food comes from. And in fact, these food videos talk about, forget about sourcing and where the food comes from, they're probably even sponsored by food companies. I mean, the levels at which even the last year have kind of undermined this whole idea of sustainability requires that as agricultural museums, we need to always connect food to its source, because without making that connection, it's sometimes a green museum, you can see it happen, but in the larger context, I don't think we see it. And I think one of the important things, as Ollie's pointed out, what are the other ways in which we can try and connect the idea of the food we eat and how sustainable is it to our own lives or the life on the planet? I mean, maybe these kind of questions need to pop up in agricultural museums. I don't know, but I think it's important. I mean, there's so much more to say, but we have only about a few minutes more, 3 minutes more. So anybody else?
And I would say Bob Clark's talk in the previous group of sessions was spot on, because it's just about the ways a community, it sustained itself, changed over time, it ultimately survived, and still helps people understand about food sourcing. But so does the dairy farm in Hong Kong, and so does the Finnish system in, as Elsie said, the northernmost agricultural country in the world. It's how do we do it? We have living history farms, and we have gardens, and we have heritage crops and folks working outside. Not any one place can do everything, but every place together can help sustain the message.
I mean, on that note, I'd just like to say one more thing, that maybe one of the things that museums could do is start drawing up oral histories of the foods, of the artifacts and the foods that they use. And those histories itself becomes like, in a sense, history from the ground. You actually see how change works out in people's lives, in families, in communities around you. Just thought.
I think that's a good idea. I think we have to look at the oral histories of the 20th century, because we tend to go back to the 19th century a lot in our thinking about museums, and I think we probably don't have enough interpretation of what's happened in our own lifetimes. Because I know in my career, agriculture has been transformed enormously, and now we're seeing the digital revolution, which is making enormous changes in agriculture and whatever. So I think we need to capture that, and I'd urge anyone running a museum, a farm museum, to really adopt digital technology in terms of animal identification and all those things, and that'll capture young people for the future, so that we don't just think of interpreting things with wooden hay forks and old varieties. That's fine, do that, but also adopt the 21st century digital stuff, because that'll make it even more relevant.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time limit, but there are so many more things to say. And there are some interesting comments also that have come in the chat window. Have a look at that. Thank you very much. I hope this at least was some food for thought, a starting spark. Let's take it forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Cameron. Bye.
Thank you, Siraja. Thank you.
And a thank you from me, Siraja, and to all our panelists for this latest session. That was absolutely fascinating. I'll throw it, you couldn't quite see it, the camera was holding it up, but I'll just throw it in that I'm actually reading Dark Emu at the moment. I'd encourage you all to go and read it. It's inspirational and really exciting. And also picking up on what Deb was saying, in reference to the previous session and the work of those sort of local sites, looking at local questions and issues, I'd urge you all to go and read her edited volume on interpreting agriculture at museums and historic sites. And also, I think you referenced it in your talk, but I can't quite remember, the follow-up volume on environment as well. Really useful texts, and obviously written with that sort of US, North American context in mind, but incredibly useful in helping us ground these stories, these big global challenges and stories in local contexts, which is sort of the lifeblood of some of what we're talking about, and lots of tensions playing out there. Thank you so much. And I think we're going to take a short 10-minute break again, rather than the 15-minute break. We'll try and play the presentations in the break as we did beforehand. So if you want to see those, they'll be there. We'll also post the YouTube links to those in the chat. So the YouTube links will be there if you want to go and get a drink or take a break. And then we'll be reconvening for the keynote session for today, which will be presided over by my colleague Isabel Hughes, and it's Adam Sutherland from Grisdale Arts. So I'll see you in 10 minutes time. Thanks all.
Thank you, Ollie.
Skep. I don white gloves and peer into the skep. The whole thing looks wet like a greasy crop, its dandruff of dry straw shredding everywhere. The inside still smells faintly of wax. A layer of filth reminds me of crusted cattle milk. I notice the label reads, livestock, bees. Death is sweet. That's something you learn young on a farm. Tiny pieces of honeycomb have dried to a crisp and turned black as scabs. I imagine the young Pownal digging a pit, lighting brimstone, placing the hive above it, waiting, a low hum fading in strength.
Hello and welcome to the Museum of English Rural Life. The museum was founded in 1951. So during and after the Second World War, there were big social and technological changes in the British countryside. This museum was founded by the University of Reading to try and capture those changes. The Museum of English Rural Life, known as the MERL, grew out of the university's long established connection with agriculture. So the museums were recently redisplayed, the galleries downstairs, in 2016 and opened to the public shortly after. So we're going to go upstairs and have a look at the open storage, the Digging Deeper gallery, which is now open and accessible to the public. So the museum's open storage contains lots of the objects in the collection. We've got over 25,000 objects, along with the archives, including documents, photographs and films, along with books in the library. So they're organised according to their type of object, so typological order. So we've got things that are grouped together, and hopefully that helps the public when they look around these open storage cases to see how things are grouped together. So the museum has a wide collection of smocks, which are garments worn by agricultural workers. Here's just one example. They have this detailed smocking panel in the centre, and they usually have embroidery at the edges. We've got a wide collection from different places around the country and different styles and ages. This is our storage area for agricultural tools. So it's a racking system, which means that they are all visible and secured safely. So it's a good visual way to show the objects. And we've got things like this wooden shovel here. We have bed warming pans. We've got forks. We've got loads of different tools, and it's all visible to the public through our glass screens. So this is our research area upstairs in the mezzanine. We use it for visitors who are coming to see specific objects or groups of visitors who may want to research, say, like a group of basket makers wanting to come and see baskets, craft workers, academics, students, and we also actually use this area for public demonstrations and visits by them. So if we're having an event in the evening, we might have a pop-up exhibition up here so that visitors can get a little bit closer to the objects and talk to members of staff. So within the object collection, we also have prints and paintings showing things from the rural countryside, like these livestock portraiture images. Thank you for joining me on my short tour of the open access galleries of the Museum of English Rural Life.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I have one or two brief announcements to make. The first is that I have an apology that there seems to have been some confusion over British summertime and Greenwich Mean Time. We're operating on British summertime. So apologies if that's caused any confusion. I will try and rectify any mistakes that are in the programme when I have a moment after today's final session. I also need to mention the technical points again. Sorry about the repetition, just to remind you all the event is being recorded. Please check your Zoom profile is your name. If you're not participating in the live activity, please keep your mic muted and your camera off. Questions can be posted in the chat. Do try and post some questions. We want to get discussion going there, and our session chairs are really keen to pick up on what the audience think about the presentations and to get a bit of dialogue going. It's very difficult in these virtual environments, obviously, but the more you involve yourselves in the chat, the more we can do that. If there are pronunciation or clarification issues, the chair might invite you to speak live. And wherever there are pre-recorded presentations, we're trying to post the links to those on YouTube in the chat. So there should be a video posted right at the top of the chat for a short introduction on how you can access subtitle translations via YouTube. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Isabel, who's chairing the final session of the day, the keynote session. I'm hoping that our keynote speaker has joined us, but we've got the length of time of his presentation for that to be the case. So Isabel, if I can ask you to share your screen, and I'll hand over to you to introduce him.
Hello, our speaker, who we seem to have lost, but he's done a wonderful presentation for us, is Adam Sutherland, and he's Director of Grisdale Arts. And the session is called Connecting Resources, Cultivating Communities. Grisdale Arts is based in Cumbria in the Lake District, and it's one of the most beautiful regions of England. And for many confirmed Londoners and city dwellers such as myself, it conjures up an essence of England. It reflects our collective love for the countryside, but also reminds us of our lack of connection with it, living as we do as a largely urban society now. It represents what we have lost through industrialization and urbanization. It is of note, I think, that the Lake District has been one of the most popular spots for visits during the pandemic, now that other countries are out of bounds for us Brits. I first became aware of Adam's work through a hugely enjoyable exhibition at the Hauser and Worth Gallery in the small market town of Bruton in Somerset. This is an unusual setup, but one that seems to be becoming more common in the United Kingdom. A commercial London gallery with a growing empire of venues, setting up an outpost in a rural setting and hosting the work of nationally significant artists. The show was called The Land We Live In, The Land We Left Behind. I know that Adam will be talking about this exhibition himself, so I won't say too much about it, except to acknowledge its variety and also that it included a truly amazing goats playground, allowing them to both climb and socialize, which was outside the exhibition building and was created by the artist Fernando Garcia Dori and produced by the Hayatsu architects. So we're going to hear now a recorded presentation from Adam, and we hope we'll have some live questions at the end. Adam is speaking to us about his work with Grisdale Arts, some of the challenges he's faced working with artists and local communities, but above all, about enabling genuine engagement for everyone's benefit. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Adam Sutherland, and I'm the director of Grisdale Arts, and I can't quite work out how to make a short film of myself doing this introduction, so I'll have to make do with this. So I'm going to move straight on to the recorded talk, and I will see you all for a Q&A at the end. Hope you enjoy it. Here are some images of the Lake District of England. Grisdale Arts is based at Lawson Park, the farm you can see in the bottom right-hand slide, which is itself based in the Grisdale Forest, which is a Forestry Commission plantation, pretty much in the middle of the Lake District. Lake District is famous for Romanticism. It's a very intense cultural centre in many ways, or historically it has been. And it's also very understood in a way as being a sort of spiritual heartland of England. I think perhaps now it is rather more understood as a tourist destination, and in that sense also understood in quite a simplistic way as a beautiful place that has not a great deal more than the fact that it's a beautiful place to offer. So that has been kind of, that notion has slightly informed the way that Grisdale as an organisation has evolved, and particularly under my directorship, the idea of generating culture, that of replacing or reinvigorating traditional histories and creating export, something that goes out of the region, that this place is not merely a receiving house for other cultures and other ideas, and for guests and visitors and people to look rather than participate. So historically, Grisdale Arts started back in the 1970s as a land art, public art space. It perhaps was interesting in that it didn't actually attempt to be a visitor attraction, and perhaps its success as a visitor attraction was partly due to that. The artists, it was an opportunity really to giving artists to work within an industry based on another program that was running in Britain at the time, placing artists in industry. So the industry here was the Forestry Commission, and the artists had the opportunity to use the plantations as a kind of studio. Notably, the first artist that came was David Nash, and David Nash in many ways set the blueprint that many artists then followed. The sculptures were in fact discovered by people, and that was very important in terms of people's engagement. So people didn't really understand that this was art they were going to look at. They just came across things in the forest, in the woods, and found them curious. And it built and became a very popular, successful art project, and which in 1990 won the Prudential Prize for the Arts, which is a big prize in the UK, still running, and a big chunk of money. One of the problems with this program after its initial innovation was that it didn't really evolve or change. And when I was brought into Grizedale, it was with the remit to reinvent. I think the history really was of the sculpture in the forest did play quite an important role in the development of public art in the UK. As we now understand public art. But that moved away from the rural very quickly, and the Grizedale programme was quite closely replicated in a more urban environment in Gateshead. And generally in the north of England, I often think that something like Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North was the kind of, in a way, culmination of a lot of work that emanated from Grizedale. Certainly a lot of the same people were involved in making that project happen. But by the time I arrived, the project was probably rather on its last legs. It had two rather short-lived directors, and I think was on the point of having the funding that it received from the Arts Council withdrawn, and it needed to re-establish, I guess, a connection with the contemporary. It had lost, as they say, traction with a lot of what was going on in the art world at that time. So I started work at Grizedale 20 years ago, and my first instinct was to kind of re-establish what I think I understood as honesty, and to be honest about the place and what it was and the people that lived here and the way that artists responded to it and all that sort of thing. So one of the first things I did was to rename a lot of the things within the centre, within the forest, which everything had been called something in the forest. So there was a gallery in the forest, and the gallery in the forest was renamed the gallery in the car park, because that actually much more closely represented what it was. It was in the middle of a very large car park. And the same went for an awful lot of things. But I think that was indicating a kind of approach to the rural, and a sort of return to let's be real about the rural. I am from a farming background myself. I was very keen to leave that behind, and in many ways I was very keen to come back to it. But I have a very ambivalent relationship with the rural, both the positive aspects of it and the negative. Initially, my reinvention was quite confrontational and brought a lot of what one might think of as fashionable artists into the context of the program, and we revived a lot of, we reinterpreted a lot of existing rural tropes like country shows. We even did a project where people got married, and we brought quite a lot of controversy to the forest in many ways. And during that period, the relationship with Forestry Commission, particularly, which was always difficult to generate, they felt that we weren't bringing tourists to the centre, that we were dealing with subjects that weren't particularly things they wanted to talk about or expose. And so eventually we kind of agreed a divorce, and they took the sculpture park and I took a derelict farmhouse. So briefly, here are a few things that the Forestry Commission weren't so keen on. And I would say a wider public, particularly kind of local visiting tourism public, didn't really enjoy. Very popular in the art world, and lots of artists established their reputations based on this period of Grizedale's history. Anyway, moving on, let's have a look at the building that we took on in exchange for all this, which was this. This was Lawson Park. So quite a fascinating building. Its history, earliest records 1338. It came with 15 acres of upland, pretty hopeless agriculturally. I think that there might have been a early attempt at agricultural settlement here by the Furness Abbey monks, who were largely Cistercian, but before them there was an order of Sauvignac monks whose specialism really was cultivating marginal land, and I have a feeling that Lawson Park might have been part of that, possibly unsuccessful. But its principal history was as a centre for charcoal burning, and that was in order to facilitate iron smelting in the valley. So this was a really industrial valley back in the 14th and 15th century. It then turned to sheep farming, relatively unsuccessfully. Its sort of most notable 19th century history was that it was bought by John Ruskin as part of the Brantwood estate right at the end of Ruskin's life, and he took a strong interest in the farm and the people farming there, but it was very subsistence farming, very unsuccessful. And after 1900 it more or less fell out of use, a brief return to cultivation during the war, again not very successfully. And when we acquired it, it was entirely derelict. And so we set about initially redeveloping it as a building that we could use. And yeah, I think somehow there were some mistakes in that. We went through a process with the Arts Council and a full design team, and there was a slight sense of the kind of idea of a vision being foisted, or let's say a big vision for the whole project, which in retrospect, I feel was a mistake, that the whole project should have evolved more organically, which it eventually did do, but initially we had this big push to convert the building so that we could use it. And then over the years, it's evolved. So it was more in conjunction with communities and with conjunction with a very large cross-section of people, from artists to local communities. One of the key things we were interested in was a shift from encouraging artists to make art in this interesting context, and then promoting that art to local people, to the wider community, and most successfully, of course, to the art world. And the shift we went through when we started working at Lawson Park was that we would no longer make the invitation to the artist, that we would wait for invitations from the community to do specific projects, things that people actually wanted to happen and were the projects that people were properly engaged with. And that, it seems like a really simple change, but actually really vital in terms of the value really in what we're doing, and the interest and the involvement, the participation from communities. So that Lawson Park was kind of part of that shift, but largely it was generated by the arts organisation. And I think in many ways what we were trying to do was demonstrate that through the arts you could take on a building which had been abandoned and was, local advice was don't go near it. You'll never get that working, and to demonstrate that through a sort of creative process and creative working, that it could be, you could generate something that did work. And it was a different way of using these resources, and fundamentally that ambition was making the most of the existing resources and evolving and developing those resources. So that really keys into the idea of working to invitation. So in terms of the local community, we worked to invitation to then develop aspects within the local village in a very similar way to how we developed Lawson Park. So these are the ingredients, and this is a more creative way of putting them together that works and generates productive and economically viable solutions. So Lawson Park, this is, you see an image of the gardens here, basically hacked out of some very unbiodiverse land at 600 feet above sea level, never really been properly cultivated. And over 20 years, in fact, that we've been working on the gardens, we've managed to generate, we've built soil. That's the most important thing. We've created soil, and that's created the biodiversity and the range, and in fact now the kind of richness. In fact, we slightly find Lawson Park a little bit embarrassing in a way, because it's become a bit too much of a kind of luxury hotel look, rather than something that's sort of been made out of nothing. Some images from the interior of the building. As you can see, as I was mentioning, it's like luxury hotel look. Slightly embarrassing, but not really the intention. But if you keep going at something for long enough, it just sort of gets a bit like that. So the interiors are generated through our collections policy. So we set up a number of aesthetics that we wanted to represent in the building, which are drawn from local aesthetics as we'd identified them. And we set up a number of collection headings, which were mostly to do with design and design movements that felt that through design they would change the world and improve the world. So everything in the building has some kind of resonance and significance. There is no actual design going on. It is literally a collection of things that are in use. So it's as a collection, it acts as a real inspiration to a lot of people that come here, and a lot of people will key into the collection before they come here, in fact, and that will be one of the reasons that the things that they strands of content that they follow up on. Nothing is of huge value. Most things were bought from secondhand sites, from were gifted, or there's a few artist commissions within the building, but yeah, it's a rich and complex collection. You can find out more about it online. Here's a few images from the outside. Lots of different artists, lots of different architects, designers, gardeners, all sorts. It's very much a collective effort that generates the interiors and the exteriors of the building, and is in constant state of evolution. And then a few images of food. These are from some time ago. But yeah, so we generate quite a lot of food. It's quite an important part of the program that people are involved in growing. I guess the whole project has a kind of symbolic relevance to the ambitions of the organization and how we more generally work. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, from the base of Lawson Park and the organisation of Grisdale Arts, we became involved with the Coniston Institute by the invitation of the Institute Committee. And this is amazing and very interesting building with an extraordinary history, and some images of it here back more or less when it was built, 1878, I think it was. And the opening of the Ruskin Museum a few years later. The ambition of it's a mechanics institute, so it's really its ambition is to be an education centre, or a form of education for local people, working people. And the museum was set up very much in that light as well. And around the building, which was very multifunctional, had a bathhouse in it, for example, and a shop, and It's a very diversified offer, a little bit like a 1970s art centre. But yeah, around that, they also developed a series of schools, craft schools principally, lace making, wood carving, and metal repoussé, all quite simple crafts that people could quite quickly pick up and then develop and get better at. A lot of it was initially designed by artists, and then as people became more competent, they took it up. But the ambition of the schools was to an enhanced form of education. It was to help people develop. It also really worked as a real arts and crafts movement, in that people were able to make things they could sell, but also that they could afford to keep. So it wasn't particularly high end. It was all fairly everyday, workaday in many ways. There's an additional image here of the Migratory Dairy School, which is a fascinating project, which was actually established during the late 19th century depression, and was a peripatetic school that taught farmers how to produce, pack, and send butter by train to major centres. And so, yeah, kind of, again, like all the schools, very successful. Or most of the schools kind of petered out in the during the Second World War. What we tried to do, so I should say, we were invited by the Institute Committee to help them reinvent the building, and so that some of the ideas were about turning it into a conference facility and knocking it down, turning it into housing and various other things. And what we encouraged was the renovation of the building and the making best use of what was there, but drawing from the history, and using what was really a very solid and well-built educational institution. So you can see some images here of lots of different schools that we started up. We set up a volunteer program and we started renovating the building. It's all fairly easy, straightforward, and obvious, really. In 5 or 6 years of working there, so quite durational, quite long term, quite embedded, we were able to run a huge range of really interesting, dynamic projects that reinvented the building based on its sort of original uses, and made it, turned it from basically point of bankruptcy and near dereliction into an organisation that was a couple of years ago turning over £250,000 a year. So really quite without grants, without any external financial assistance. So again, making use of what exists here. At which point the Institute was kind of put back on the map in terms of being an important part of the village and important part of village culture, and perhaps more importantly, important part of income. And so the end result of that really was that the parish council decided that it was something that they should take a stronger hand in, and there was perhaps less need for an arts organisation in that, and less needs for the arts, in fact, that should be more orientated towards profit-making enterprise. So I can't say it wasn't disappointing for us, because it didn't feel like we'd really got as far as we needed to go with the project. The idea of it was about helping people think more creatively about the everyday, and using art and creativity as a way to rethink what they did and how they do it. And as part of that, we encouraged people to we took people on projects that we used to do in other parts of the world. So this is an images of a project in Korea. That's a local farmer looking out over Soul, and it's like parody of the Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist, I think it's called. And the ambition there really was about people seeing how things were done in other parts of the world and being involved with us in creative projects, mostly which were about solving problems or solving economic issues. I mean, most of our projects were around trying to generate things that were of value, of use, that were valued by the communities in which they were going to exist. And the impact of that on those people who were able to come with us on those projects was that they rethought how they worked when they got back. So in a way, that was the process of kind of persuading, I suppose, or suggesting that thinking creatively was a good way to kind of break the deadlock you might find yourself in. And that was very evident with a number of people in the village. And so that started to happen. And there was a sort of transformation starting to happen at the point that we were, in effect, no longer needed, just at the point when we were most needed, perhaps. Anyway, that was what happened, and we withdrew really from working at the Institute, carrying on with our international program. It's an image from a project on the rural exhibition about rural culture that we did for Hazard and Worth in Somerset, which is a commercial gallery, but it was an opportunity for us to bring together all of the social projects that we've been engaged in over the years, but also connect up with a lot of the international projects. So bringing all of that stuff under one roof and doing a kind of history of the arts within the rural context, making the case that through the rural, some of the creative thinking is perhaps different from the way that people think in urban, or how creativity works in urban spaces. It's much more haphazard and random, and the collisions and car crashes of projects and creative ideas are generate perhaps bigger or more unusual creative leaps. Whereas in an urban context, you can kind of work with like-minded people the whole time. So it's a sort of much more linear in its trajectory. But I was thinking about those kind of ideas in terms of how things evolve in rural places and how we create a culture that we can export from that rural context. There's another project which was in Ireland for the Irish Museum of Modern Art, where we generated an economy based on courgettes. So you can see in the background of the picture the courgette field with 350 courgette plants planted into a straw bale system. And for this project, we invited 4 villages from around the world to contribute to building this new village in a way. So we built the economy with the intention of building the housing to service the economy once the economy was established. We didn't ever get around to building the houses, sadly. The economy worked. Of course, quite subsidised. Or the setting up of it was subsidised. The courgettes were generated £10,000 a week for a short period of time, which was quite fun, quite gratifying. And that project also led into another project, which in Japan, and are working with one of the villages that we connected with there, and trying to rethink how that village would work in the future. So this was a school program which we are still involved with. We're still running. In this instance, we built a Slovenian bee house for beekeeping as a part of a school of beekeeping where we were utilising 3 abandoned paddy fields in a very beautiful setting. And I guess the suggestion really to the village was you can make honey, but you will have a much richer, on many levels, experience if you teach people how to keep bees. So financially, that you'll make more money, but you'll also meet a lot of interesting people, and you'll have some interaction. And one of the big issues in these in all the villages that we were involved in outside of the UK, that everybody has the same issues of dwindling populations, collapsing infrastructure, aging. Basically, most extreme in Japan, where there are nobody in that village under the age of 65 and little chance of a future for that way of life and the amazing range of skills that they have beyond the next 20 years. So it's quite urgent issue, and it is reflected everywhere. Our ambitions are around generating an exchange, so that it's not really it's not necessarily saying do it this way, or this is an example of how to do things. It's people are doing things in different ways in different contexts, but everybody's kind of dealing with the same issues. This might be the wrong way to do it. It might be a better way to do it. We're not necessarily saying one thing or the other, but what we want, I think, is the idea to think more broadly about how you might address the perceived problems, and how you might see your own context in a wider perspective. And so where you sit in the world rather than where you sit in a very small community in a valley, as in our case. So I'm talking about trying to combine these different elements throughout this talk. It's been the creative, the artist culture, you couldn't call it that, local culture, local communities, and an international perspective and international communities and culture. And how do you bring all these three components into play with one another on a kind of even playing field? So what that led us to really was purchasing this pub called, well, it's an inn, the Farmer's Arms. It's at the head of the valley in which Grisdale operates, Crake Valley, and it's been derelict for a few years. It had been very much the heart of the community. It has a similar history to Lawson Park, was most likely established by Furness Abbey monks as part of trade routes through the Lake District. And it was very much embedded in the heart of the community, as people have enormously warm memories of it. Not very diverse memories, mostly getting drunk, but yeah, they do have very warm memories of it. It also comes with 6 acres of land, and it is the gateway. And so we saw the opportunity. Again, it was by invitation, so the local community wanted to save it, and they asked us to help. We got involved in fundraising and putting forward a vision for the site and what its role would be in the wider context. And that is very much combining all the things that I've been talking about right through this talk. I'll just briefly recap a touch on that. So making the most of what already exists, reconnecting what already exists, expanding and developing creatively on those resources. This is one example of that, a teaching garden that we've just set up with a local farmer about 2 miles up the valley. They have given us an area of land to work with, and we've run a school to build a shelter and a garden shed with some architects you can see listed there, and now we've set up a school which meets monthly for a full day. And we've replicated that idea and that system in for a number of different projects that, again, are about connecting the resources of the valley. Another example would be this project with St. Martin's School of Architecture, which was to build a bread oven, which is now in regular use and is a great drawing together of people, mostly to eat, but needless to say. I suspect that's my time up. I hope that's been reasonably clear. It's a very complicated picture. It is a much bigger network than I've been able to describe today, but I am now, we're opening up for questions. So please feel free to ask whatever you like. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think that was a really fascinating and wide-ranging talk, and it's hard to know where to begin. You ranged around so much, but one thing I was really struck by was your thoughts about working with communities and how strongly you felt that your project should come through the community and be part of the community. And I wonder, could you talk a bit about how you identify who is the community? How do you identify those people? How do you get to know them and know what they want to do and then enthuse them?
Yeah, well, the invitations tend to come from existing groups. So that it'll be, for example, the cricket club, who would come to us and ask us to help them build a new cricket pavilion. So, I mean, you can't really say this is the community, and because it's such a complicated question. One of the reasons I think I was particularly interested in working with communities here was that they were so fractured and so competitive, in fact, and they didn't really, I mean, my sense was that people didn't really work together. And that is perhaps down to the intense tourism of this area and the notion of people competing for that tourist market. So I think it's the notion of communities here is super complex. But from our perspective, we just work with whoever invites us, or as many of those people as we're able to work with. So something like the pub came out of, there was a huge interest in saving the building. There was a community, there was a meeting arranged by by a district councillor. 70 people came along. We were asked to go. Basically, people said, how are we going to do this? And North Grisdale helped us do it. So that group of 70 people was very diverse. Quite a lot of them didn't get on. It was in fact, the meeting was full of arguing.
Creative arguing, though, is it?
All very destructive and difficult arguing, antagonistic, folded arms, cross men. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing particularly jolly about communities, I don't think. You know, it's quite easy to. It's a funny word that sort of gets morphed into being a super positive thing, but actually, it's full of problems and difficulties. Like any society, it's just a microcosm of everything else that's around us. But definitely interested in working in other countries and the different issues that communities have in, say, Japan or Korea, or any of the countries we work in. The way that people interact, the socializing, or the way that people work together is very, very different. But very interesting I think that's what's really interesting. It's the same issues, and there's the same problems, the same divisions, and the same frictions in the communities, but the pressures are different as to how you deal with them. Like very typical Japanese phrase, for example, the nail that stands up will be knocked down. So the idea, which is a positive, not a negative. So this is kind of a reversal of what romanticism might have led us to believe, that the nail that stands up is the exceptional and special. but the idea of working together collectively, that then provides an enormous amount of peer pressure, and a lot of Japanese people hate that, find that really difficult, that they feel obliged. One of the reasons a lot of the rural communities find it hard to develop is because people coming in are expected to fit in, really fit in exactly to the system.
Mm. Mm. And you mentioned people coming in, because another aspect that I pick up is the tension there is with tourism and Cumbria in particular. I mean, tourism is massively important, but does it?
Or is it?
You clearly didn't want to work with tourist bodies, is that right?
Definitely don't want to work with people that manage tourism. No.
Yeah. No.
Or any national bodies. I mean, they make so many bad decisions in 20 years of being here, just watching one bad decision after another, and then the consequences of it, and then the attempt to reverse those consequences is very frustrating. But I think, I mean, tourism is a resource. I personally don't really adhere to this notion that the entire county is dependent on the tourist economy. I think it's not really an economy. It's an exchange of money between two people. There's no complex economy. Well, not none, but there's limited follow through in the economy. It doesn't link a number of different industries together. I mean, farmers have in many cases have absolutely no benefit from tourism. Some rent out cottages or camping sites or something, but it's limited compared to the kind of income that perhaps people are generating in other forms of tourism. What I do think about tourism is that it should be this really positive force, and there needs to be a way of helping the process of visiting a place be more participatory, be more involved, and less destructive. I think a lot of tourists, they're looking for authenticity, and at the same time as looking for authenticity, they're destroying it. So you really could look at the Lake District and say, well, the real culture of the place has been kind of more or less scrubbed clean. And in some ways, I think what Grisdale does, and probably other places do as well, is a sort of process of kind of rebuilding and reshaping, remaking a local culture, which then appears authentic. I mean, I quite often notice we've done things that people think must have been there for hundreds of years, like the village always meet on a Monday and have lunch together. Of course it does. There's no history of that at all, but it looks very authentic. And of course the arts and crafts movement was busy doing that reinvention as well. So it's not it's not the first time that's happened.
I've got a couple of questions from my colleague Ollie, and the first one is, we've been talking earlier today about how agriculture operates at a personal, local, national and global level, and he's struck by the very strong homely personal level, local level and international. But do you think there's a national level too to your work?
I mean, I think that inevitably the national issues are reflected on in the programme, but we don't attempt to kind of major in any one area. It's not like we're promoting permaculture or whatever, but there are people involved in the programme that are interested in that. There's a very wide range of people that we're working with, probably about 60 people at any one time, all with different areas of interest. But personally, my own interest is creating a more interesting place to live in. And that's take that as broadly as you can. But on one hand, it is like on a village or rural level, I want to live in an interesting village, but I also want to live in an interesting world. And I think that that's a very sort of simplistic way of looking at what we're trying to do, but in a way, that it does make sense, and it follows through and is held within the programme as a notion, wherever we're working, whatever country that's in.
Thank you. Another one from Ollie, that, again, earlier sessions, we've touched on complex environmental issues and urgent questions of colonial legacy. These questions arguably feel far removed from English rural contexts and communities, but they're not really. And have you met local and community-led resistance to particular themes or projects that you've been keen to activate?
Yes. I'll answer that question.
Go on, spill the beans.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's resistance, and one of the ambitions of the program is to promote the creative value of diversity. And that idea that I mentioned in the talk about people exchanging with projects in other parts of the country, but working in those places in other parts of the world, and the impact that then has, the perspective it gives you on what you do yourself, the quite simple changes that it can promote in people to think slightly differently about who they are, where they are, and how they sit within a much wider context. It's very easy in a rural place to be very local and to be very inward looking. This valley is extraordinary for it. People in this valley do not know what goes on in the next valley over. They never go there, and they don't know anyone who lives in that valley. In fact, a parish councillor once told me that I was suggesting doing something with the next valley over, and he said, well, when she was a child, they were told to throw stones at people in the next valley. So, but I mean, that kind of mentality exists, like the difference. Even for Grisdale, we're based at Lawson Park, which is 600 feet above sea level. There's a network of farms at that level which are regarded as weird people, and always have been the weird people that live in those farms on the hills, up in the hills. So even that distance, just the demographic, the geographic difference makes for difference when things are very introverted. But I really believe that when things are expanded, that introduction of the value of diversity being a generator of creative thinking is something that I think we've been really quite successful in demonstrating, and other people have picked up, other local people have picked up and worked with. Nationally, I guess we do quite a lot of stuff with national institutions, art, but it's very much art culture. I mean, I don't think it has an awful lot to do with the rest of the world, frankly. It's its own little valley.
All right. Okay. We've got about 1 minute left, but I did want to touch very briefly on the initiatives that you'd talked about with the Mechanic Institute and taking forward the roots of the Ruskin Museum. And do you think this is a sort of sustainable model for the rest of us? To not reinvent, renew our interest in helping people to develop their skills and creativity in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's a role for art. I think it's a role for creative people. I think it's a mode of a way of developing interaction between different cultures. When the Mechanics Institute was an extraordinary movement. It started in the 1820s, and there were, I think, 700 Mechanics Institutes across the UK. And you could certainly argue that the labour movement came out of the Mechanics Institute. Certainly, a lot of people involved in uprisings, arts and crafts uprisings of the kind of early 20th century, they were educated in Mechanics Institutes. So it's a fascinating model. It's probably the inheritor of it is the 70s Arts Centre, and I feel quite a lot of regret that the way that arts funding has worked is it kind of created the museums have moved away from their more sort of community roots, despite all their programs to engage with communities. They've become much more class specific, I would say.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. That's been a really fascinating afternoon.
I don't need you. For a museum, I will say things about museums when I'm talking to a museum.
No, you're very welcome. But so I'd like to thank you once again for participating and for your talk, and thank you to everyone else for your input as well. And I don't know if Ollie has anything he'd like to say about tomorrow. Is it worth me handing back to you? Yeah.
I will just come briefly on. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you again, Adam, for a fascinating keynote session. It was great to have you with us. Just a couple of quick notes about tomorrow. We've, as I said earlier, we had some questions about the timing. I have looked into this, and I think the confusion may be the way the times were articulated in the Eventbrite bookings and the information sent out through that. We are operating on British summer time, which is the equivalent of London time. So if you find London time or British summer time, if you're converting it online, that's the timings that are given in the program, and that's the time zone we're operating on. So apologies if that's caused any confusion, and I hope you haven't missed too much of the programming. And just to say, we start tomorrow promptly at I'm just going to check the British summertime timing at 1 o'clock British summertime, London time, and that's for session 4, working with agricultural films, and that's chaired by my colleague Caroline Gould. So we'll look forward to seeing as many of you as possible, and many more besides, hopefully tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining us today.